Origen of Alexandria. Origen was born in Alexandria, Egypt, into a Christian family, and he was enrolled into the catechetical school there. He was a very pious believer, devoting himself to prayer, asceticism, and Bible study, and in time became a celebrated teacher and author. Origen was very well educated, both in biblical and Hellenistic wisdom, and unusually gifted as a thinker and teacher. He could rightly be considered both the first systematic theologian of the church and one of its greatest ever biblical exegetes. After a controversy, he was banished from Alexandria in 231-232 by a synod convened by Bishop Demetrius of Alexandria. He made his home in Caesarea, Palestine after this. Eventually, anti-Christian persecution caught up with him, and he was imprisoned and tortured under the Emperor Decius, and later died of the injuries received, age 97. Origen is, together with his faithful follower Gregory of Nyssa, the main theorizer of the doctrine of universal salvation, although by no means the only one. He theorized it not simply as a Platonist, but as a Christian Platonist, such as he was. His anti-Platonism, which has been stressed by some scholars, needs to be qualified. Origen did not oppose Platonism tout court, that is, per se, in itself or in an absolute sense, but rather Gnostic Platonism and pagan Platonism in an effort to develop an orthodox Christian Platonism. His doctrine of universal restoration and salvation is an excellent example of this nuanced approach to the wisdom of the Greeks. The principal metaphysical foundations of this doctrine of his consist in the idea that evil is non-being. Only God, who, qua supreme good, is the opposite of evil, is being. This is why to adhere to evil means to become non-being. As long as we stick to God and adhere to the one who truly is, we also are. But if we go far from God, we fall into the opposite, i.e., non-being. However, this does not mean that the ontological death of the soul. The wicked man's death or reduction to non-being is not a vanishing of the substance of his soul, but a spiritual death. And the destruction of the sinner at the judgment will be the destruction of his sin, that he may be a sinner no more, but a just man. The otherworldly fire will indeed destroy not sinners, but their evil thoughts. In fact, an important consequence of the ontological non-subsistence of evil, a Platonic notion, is that it cannot exist forever. In the Bible, this is announced in 1 Corinthians 15:24-26 and Revelation. Origen, followed by Gregory of Nyssa, argued that if God will be all in all, 1 Corinthians 15:28, then evil, which is the opposite of God, the good, will necessarily be found in no being anymore. Since Origen insists, following this biblical text, that it is in all that God will be all, and not only in few or in many, this means that salvation is definitely universal. But the final vanishing of evil from all humans will be able to take place only thanks to the inhumanation, death, and resurrection of Christ, as I shall show below. One human died, and his death not only represented a paradigm of death by devotion, but also produced the principle and advancement of the destruction of what is evil and the devil which ruled upon the whole earth. Evil has no ontological substance, and thus will have to vanish, because like death, it was not created by God, the being. It did not exist in the beginning and will not exist forever. There was a state in which evil did not exist, and there will be one in which evil will not exist anymore. Origen will inspire Evagrius' famous motto, "There was a time when evil did not exist, and there will come a time when it will exist no more." If evil will disappear from all beings, then as announced in 1 Corinthians 15:28 and Acts 3:20-21, all beings will be restored into the good and thus be saved. A righteous person keeps her hope in the shadow of the wings of God until evil will be entirely destroyed. After the abolition of evil and its annihilation into non-being, this person will no longer place her hope in a shadow, but in the Godhead itself. When every evil is definitely reduced to non-being, all beings will return to the good, even Satan, who will thus be saved not qua devil, arch enemy, and death, but qua creature of God, after his conversion from evil to the good, the devil can return to being an archangel. Because he was created an archangel, he became devil due to a wrong choice of his free will. But since his will remains free, he can return to the good and be saved. Demons do not turn to good because they do not want to, and not because they cannot. And they do not want to while they continue to delight in evil. But when they stop doing so, they will return to the good. The devil and his angels in the end will not disagree with the final harmonic unity of all, a Platonic ideal that Origen also grounds in John 17. Once things have begun to rush toward the ideal state in which all are one just as the Father is one with the Son, as a logical consequence, we must believe that when all are one, there will be no divergence anymore. Even demons will no longer be powers of evil, but return to their angelic state and ascend to the angelic hierarchies. After a purification and illumination that can take extremely long. Origen says this: every being will be restored to be one, and God will be all in all. However, this will not happen in a moment, but slowly and gradually through innumerable eons of indefinite duration, because correction and purification will take place gradually, according to the needs of each individual. Thus, whereas some with a faster rhythm will be the first to hasten to the goal, and others will follow them closely, yet others, on the contrary, will fall a long distance behind. And in this way, through innumerable orders constituted by those who make progress, and after being enemies are reconciled with God, there will come the last enemy, death, that this may be destroyed, and there may be no enemy left. Death, which is no creature of God, will vanish. Not even the devil will be any longer enemy in death. This death is not just the death of the body, but that of the soul due to sin. Once the death of the soul, which is the very last enemy, has been destroyed, the kingdom of death, together with death itself, will be wiped out. That death will vanish means that all rational creatures will be pure from sin. We can say that the death of the world comes to an end when the sin of the world dies, explaining in the words of the apostle, and after he was put all enemies under his feet, then the last enemy, death, will be destroyed. No one will do evil anymore, and evil will govern no one. There will be no one who does evil anymore, as there will be no evil anymore. The liberation of creation from death will be a liberation from the devil. Even demons will be freed. Let us now see what will be the liberation of creation and the end of enslavement. At the end of the world, when souls and rational creatures will be, so to say, pushed by the Lord out of the locks and gates, some will move more slowly due to their laziness. Others will fly swiftly with their zeal. But when Christ will have handed the kingdom to God the Father, then these creatures too, which earlier had become a part of the kingdom of Christ, along with the rest of the kingdom, will be handed to the Father, that this may rule over them. Thus, when God will be all in all, as these also are a part of the all, God will be in them as in all. The importance of a free will in Origen does not exclude universal salvation. For in Principle 1.6.3, Origen argues that demons and the devil himself will return to the good in the end precisely because they always keep their free will. The latter does not conflict with God's providential action in universal salvation, as is clear if all the factors that St. Paul listed cannot separate us from God's love, still less shall our free will be able to separate us from God's love. In fact, I do not deny in the least that rational natures will always keep its free will, but I declare that the power and effectiveness of Christ's cross and of his death, which he took upon himself toward the end of the eons, are so great as to be enough to set right and save not only the present and the future eon, but also the past ones, and not only this order of us humans, but also the heavenly orders and powers. Salvation will have to be voluntary for all by means of a conversion that will be enabled by the healing action of Christ. For nothing is impossible for the omnipotent. No being is incurable for the one who created it. Christ God, who created all, including the devil, will be able to heal all, even the devil. In souls, there is no illness caused by evilness that is impossible to cure for God, the Logos, who is superior to all. It is thanks to Christ's Logos that what Origen foresees will be accomplished. Many prophecies mysteriously speak of the complete elimination of evil and rectification of every soul. The ultimate end is the restoration even of the devil who will voluntarily submit to Christ's logos and be saved. He will be saved only once he has returned to the good. Origen's insistence on the importance of free will informed his polemic against Gnostic determinism, as well as his criticism of the Stoic notion of Apocatastasis, which was characterized by an endless sequence of eons, ages in each of which the same people will always behave in the same way. Origen's idea of Apocatastasis, on the contrary, entails a limited number of eons after which the universal restoration will take place, a stage in which there will be no eon anymore. Moreover, in each eon, rational creatures' moral choices will not be identical to previous eons, but different, and the eons will see the rational creature's spiritual development. They will offer to all rational creatures the time to get purified, illuminated, and thus voluntarily adhere to God. Soon after accusing the Stoic theory of Apocatastasis of annihilating human free will, Origen claims that the eons will come to an end. This end will coincide with the universal restoration and salvation, when all will be no more in an eon, but God will be all in all. All creatures will pass from being in the eons to being in God. We ought to stress here that when the Bible mentions eons, it does not refer to eternity, for only God is truly eternal, while eons have a limited duration. This implies that all scriptural expressions such as aionios, death, Ionian fire, or Ionios punishment, which refer to the death, fire, and punishment in the next eon, cannot be interpreted as eternal fire, death, or punishment, because the next eon and all eons will come to an end when there will be the passage from the eons to God. Origen describes Apocatastasis as a passage into the Trinity at the end of time. The scriptural expressions that refer to the preparation of the stones, which are pulled up and prepared for the building of the construction, seem to me to certainly indicate the totality of time, that is, the extension that is necessary for rational creatures to finally come to be in the eternal Trinity. Origen indeed identified the ultimate end with restoration and deification, communion with the divine. It is the Christ Logos who makes the eventual deification possible. The theology of deification itself, according to Origen, is grounded in Scripture. Origen bases his argument on 1 John 3:2. He says, "We shall be like God and see God as God is. You too will have to become God in Jesus Christ." And he explicitly relies on Psalm 82:6 as interpreted by Jesus in John 10:34. Those who will follow Christ and enter with him the inner parts of the temple and ascend to the heights of heaven will no longer be humans, but according to Christ's teaching, will be like angels of God. Matthew 22:30. It is even possible that there is realized what the Lord said, "I have said you are gods, and you are children of the Most High." Then one must become an angel and even God. Thus there will be a passage from being in time to being in God, i.e., in eternity. For God alone is eternal. None of the creatures are. This is why the life that will be a participation in God's life truly is eternal. Death, on the contrary, which is a consequence of sin and no creature of God, is not eternal. Origen says, "I do not think that this reign of death is eternal as that of life and justice is, especially in that I hear from the apostle that the last enemy, death, must be destroyed. For should one suppose the eternity of death is the same as that of life, death will no longer be the contradictory opposite of life, but equal to it. For eternal is not the contradictory of eternal, but the same thing. Now it is certain that death is the contradictory of life. Therefore, it is certain that if life is eternal, death cannot possibly be eternal. When the death of the soul, which is the very last enemy, has been destroyed, also this common death, which, as I said, is a sort of shadow of the death of the soul, will necessarily be abolished, and the kingdom of death, along with death itself, will be wiped out. If the death of the soul due to sin must be destroyed in the end, then all rational creatures will return to life, free from sin. Origen knew that death is only called aionios, otherworldly of the next eon, and never aidios, eternal, which is rather reserved to life and beatitude. And indeed, the Bible explicitly speaks of the eventual destruction of death, 1 Corinthians 15:26. Therefore, Origen is certain that life and justice will be eternal, but death will not. For the whole eon is long in relation to us, but it is quite short and is only tantamount to a few years in relation to the life of God, of Christ, and of the Holy Spirit, which is eternal. Hebrews 1:2 indeed declares that the eon was created by Christ, and on the basis of this verse, Origen claims that the eons are but a creature of the eternal God. Eternity characterizes only the Trinity. Creatures can become eternal only by grace and as a participation in the life of the divine Trinity. Thus, Origen never describes otherworldly death, punishment, or fire as aidia, eternal. He only calls them aionia, because they last in the future eons or eon, but not after the end of all eons and the eternal restoration. Henry Cruzel, an authoritative scholar in Origen studies, makes the same point. Quote, the essential reason fire Iona did not seem to Origen to necessarily imply the eternity or punishment as we understand it is that the adjective Ionia retains for him all the ambiguity of the word which is derived from ion. In both testaments, besides the meaning eternity conceived as endless duration, there is another which we translate age, meaning as long period of time, especially the duration of the present word. Hence, the synonymy between world and age, or the world to come. In Origen's homily 4, Origen clearly distinguishes between the future eon, which will be a temporal interval, and the absolute eternity that will come after the end of all eons. At the end of all eons, in the eternal restoration, all will come to be no longer in any eon, but in God will be all in all. 1 Corinthians 15:28. For those who consider Origen to be a heretic, antiliterum, even before the definition of orthodoxy, it is salutary to note that Origen's doctrine of rational creatures and their ultimate restoration and salvation was elaborated on in the context of his defense of orthodoxy and divine goodness. It was developed in his case for human free will in his related polemic against Gnostic predestinationism and the separation between the Old and the New Testament and between justice and goodness in the God that both Marcionites and many Gnostics advocated. He starts from this very polemic dictated by his concern for theodicy and ends up with expounding the theory of restoration and salvation of all rational creatures after their purification and illumination. This saves theodicy by reconciling divine goodness. Rufinus understood this and consequently observed that the supporters of universal salvation, i.e. Origen, intended to defend God's justice and respond to those who claim that all things are moved either by fate or by chance. Origen, wanting to defend God's justice, thought that it is worthy of the good, immutable, and simple nature of the Trinity to restore each one of its creatures in the ultimate end, into the state in which it was created from the beginning, and after long torments that can extend over whole eons to finally put an end to punishments. Rufinus exactly understood Origen's motivations for the construction of his theory of universal salvation, and rightly noticed that theodicy was Origen's main anxiety. Just as Origen elaborated his doctrine of universal salvation in defense of orthodoxy against the heretics of his day, Marcionites and Gnostics, in the same way Gregory of Nyssa, especially in his commentary on 1 Corinthians 15:28, maintained the very same doctrine against Arianism. It is no accident that in this very commentary he shows a pervasive influence from Origen. Origen and Gregory indeed put the doctrine of universal salvation in the service of their polemic against heresy as well as against paganism.